So I'm going to talk this morning or this evening, depending where you are, on the Earth system sort of side of AerChemMIP. Yeah, trying to get my. This is interesting. Sorry, I'm just getting the slides moved. So. Yeah, so this is my U figure of the Earth system. So in CMIP 6, more and more models included Earth system components. So although, of course, the physical scientists love the greenhouse gases and the physical bit, we've introduced our nice chemistry and aerosols into their physical models, which will, of course, affect how they work and the results that they give. And that's what AerChemMIP was about. It was really focused on the CMIP 6 Earth system models, trying to diagnose how they were getting the results they did and basically pulling out the contributions in those models that came from aerosols, reactive greenhouse gases, ozone precursors, and so on. So that was sort of the bit explaining why they get the climate results they do. Of course, that gives us, from a chemistry aerosol point of view, a way of also diagnosing composition changes and air quality changes, excuse me, as we heard on Friday from these. But this did mean that AerChemMIP had less emphasis on the sort of the fundamental aerosol chemistry science question. So if you were building a MIP from the bottom up, saying what do we want to learn about chemistry, fundamentals in the atmosphere, maybe would have had some slight different design of experiments. But it's possible we could still add some complementary experiments. I think Fiona mentioned a couple on Friday to fill in some of the gaps to give us perhaps more of the addressing different sides of the process. So the overall aim of AerChemMIP was sort of addressing on how does the Earth system respond to forcing, and particularly focusing on the aerosols and chemistry side of the answer to this question. So this was then sort of broken down into further bits such as the radiative forcing, future changes in composition, uncertainties, and how does climate feedback affect five climate feedbacks within aerosols and chemistry affect the overall climate feedback of these CMIP 6 models. So I'm going to sort of try and go through some of these one at a time. So I'm going to probably spend most time focusing on the radiative forcing. So these are the radiative forcing bar charts from the last IPCC report. And so in AerChemMIP, we wanted to get some data that could be used to generate equivalents from the CMIP 6 models. So these bar charts either attribute the radiative forcing to the concentrations, so that's this left-hand plot here, or another way of looking at it was ascribing excuse me, the radiative forcing to changes in emissions of reactive gases and aerosol components. So I'm just going to briefly dive into a bit of a definition of what we mean by radiative forcing, because these definitions have changed subtly over the evolution of the IPCC reports. And I'll explain why this is important in a second. So the preferred definition now is this effective radiative forcing, which is defined as being the full radiative response to a change in composition or emission, allowing everything in the atmosphere to change except surface temperature. So if you're familiar with the schematic from the last assessment, the IPCC report, effectively this middle diagram C is the change in radial forcing that's independent of temperature. Also going to use here a definition of instantaneous radial forcing or stratospheric radial adjusted radial forcing that's different from the last IPCC report, where these were defined at the tropopause. Because we tend to define this effective radial forcing at the top of the atmosphere, it makes sense to actually define these instantaneous radial forcing or stratospheric adjusted radial forcings at the top of the atmosphere as well, rather than the troposphere. So this came in some papers based on PDR-MEP from Chris Smith and Tal Tang, and it makes it easier to understand what's happening in the effective radial forcing if you define everything at the top of the atmosphere, just for consistency, because it means you can build up your effective radial forcing by starting off with your instantaneous forcing and adding in all these adjustments one by one, adding in temperature changes in the troposphere and the stratosphere, adding in changes to water vapor and clouds and so on, land surface temperature and albedo. And particularly, this wasn't covered in AerChemMIP, but what I'm going to cover this morning is changes in the atmosphere to the composition. So if you change one component in the atmosphere, how does it change other components of the atmosphere? And obviously, the chemistry is going to be a key part of that. So we came up with some fairly simple experiments in AerChemMIP to quantify this. So you have a control simulation where every emission and every concentration is set to pre-industrial 1850, and then a whole set where all these concentrations or emissions were set to 2014 levels, just varying one at a time, or in some of these a group of species at a time. And the change in the top of atmosphere forcing gives us our ERF from those. This is some results we got from this. So I'm going to talk a lot about two papers that have been accepted last week from Jill Thornhill, where she's looked at all these results from the CMIP6 models that contributed to AerChemMIP. So it's fairly easy to quantify this change in effective radial forcing. You just look at the difference in the top of atmosphere flux between your experiment and your control. And you can see she's quantified the effective radial forcing for a whole range of aerosol species and a whole range of reactive gases. But that's only the first step. So I mean, that's, if you like, the end point, the answer. But what we're interested in from a sort of a more process point of view is how do we get to those values? So this is now breaking this down a bit into the different components, the different adjustments that go between the sort of instantaneous forcing and your effective radial forcing at the end. So this schematic here down at the bottom left shows what might happen if you add some, for instance, absorbing pollutant in the atmosphere. The blue line is supposedly the unperturbed temperature profile. So you might change the shape of this temperature profile, which by changing your stability of the atmosphere, you might affect the amount of clouds. And we have to take into account these changes when we're working out what that means for the top of atmosphere change in radial forcing. Ryan Kramer did this, so working on Jill's paper. So what you can do is take all these changes in clouds and temperature and humidity and so on that you diagnose from these model runs, and use kernels which quantify the change in radial forcing per change in cloud or per change in temperature in a 3D sense. And you can come up with these rapid adjustments to understand how the effective radial forcing differs from your instantaneous radial forcing. And that's what's shown in this top bar chart here. Is the instantaneous radial forcing is the grey bars, the effective radial forcing is the blue bars, and the adjustment to those, i.e. the difference between the two, is in orange. Now, if you've been familiar with what's happened in trying to estimate the effective radial forcing from black carbon in previous work from PDRMIP or perhaps from Bjorn Samset, the adjustments that we found, or Jill found in this paper, seem to be much less than were found in previous papers. I'm not quite sure what that is. Effectively, this is just the raw model results. They just seem to be having less of a adjustment to black carbon. But yeah, so I'm just showing black carbon as an example, but of course Jill did this with Ryan for every species in AerChemMIP. So that's the chemical adjustments. Sorry, that was the meteorological adjustments. But of course, as we're also interested in the chemical adjustments to a change in, for instance, in reactive greenhouse gases, which can also be called part of the effective radial forcing. So if you think if you've got your reactive greenhouse gas, you have a direct radiative effect. Then you have a meteorological effect, as I've just shown in the previous slide, and then a chemical adjustment through maybe changing ozone and aerosols. In a similar way that you can calculate the kernels for the radiative response to a change in water vapor or temperature, you can calculate a kernel here for the change in ozone. So this is the change in ozone, for instance, for changing NOx emissions. Not surprisingly, you get a big increase in the troposphere right up to the tropopause. And Ragnhild Scheer from Cicero calculated a kernel for these, which is shown here in the bottom left. And I don't know how clear it will come out on your screen, but there's a green blob in the middle of the stratosphere, which is actually where changes in mid to upper stratospheric ozone give you a negative radiative forcing per change in ozone. So if you multiply these ozone changes by that radiative kernel, you come up with the radiative forcing due to ozone in each of these chemically reactive emission changes or concentration changes in the case of methane. So we've now got the ozone forcing per change in methane, NOx, VOCs, so on, N2O, and halocarbons. So that's now a way of adding in yet another adjustment, gone for instantaneous radiative forcing, adding in meteorology, now adding in the chemistry. So we can see, well, does all this add up? So what I've done here in this plot is try to add up all these components of the ERF. So here, let's take it from methane. So the methane, the red part of these bars, I should say each of these bars is a different model. The red part of the bar is the contribution of the methane radiative forcing, estimated using the analytical calculation of Etminan et al. Then the green bar is the ozone forcing, calculated using Ragnhild's kernel. And then some of these, well, there's a light blue contribution to these bars, which comes from changes in clouds, and these are diagnosed using Ryan Kramer's cloud forcing kernels. And I've plotted two symbols on here, a The cross is effectively the sum of all the bars. And a star, doesn't quite look much like a star, but these are stars here, show the effective radiative forcing. So for most of these models, these agree pretty well. And the interest of the UK AerChemMIP, which is the second bar in here, the orange bars and crosses, has by far the largest effective radiative forcing response to methane. We can actually break that down almost exactly into the methane component, the ozone component, and the cloud component. So I thought that was really quite nice that these agreed with each other. Not everything agrees. So I put a circle down here around the halocarbon contributions. So again, these now have a positive. A red bar is now the direct forcing from the halocarbons, and then the green bars the negative forcing from ozone changes, and then some cloud contributions. And for a lot of these, particularly for the UK AerChem and for CNRM, it turns out that for some reason the ERF is notably lower than you might expect by adding all the components together. And Olaf has explained this nicely in a paper of his, looking at how actually the forcing from, or the ERF from halogens is often negative, and you can certainly see here for CNRM and UK AerChem, it does turn out that the ERF from halogens is negative. So I guess this might mean, contrary to what other people have been suggesting, that the Montreal Protocol for these species may actually have, if you believe those models, have been bad for climate. Other things that change. So, of course, in these Earth system models, we've kept methane fixed, but we can work out what would have happened in an Earth system model if you didn't keep methane fixed, by diagnosing the change in methane lifetime. This was a diagnostic that came from all the models. So here we've got the change in methane lifetime, again, from adding methane, NOx, and so on. And you can add these to those bars I showed on the previous plot. These are the pink colors here, just showing, you won't be surprised to see that the effect of NOx, the overall effect of NOx on climate, turns out to be a cooling, because the decrease in methane outweighs, the pink bars outweigh the change in ozone, the green bars. So we expect to have these chemical adjustments to reactive species, but are there also chemical adjustments to carbon dioxide? So the carbon dioxide ERF and meteorological adjustments were calculated by Chris Smith in a paper this year. But there was no consideration, or rather that the total ERF will have included some chemical adjustment, but that wasn't broken out or diagnosed in that paper. And that's really because we haven't got enough data on this uploaded to the SGF site. So there's a bit, sort of sporadic bits from various models. So we can see, for instance, in a couple of models that uploaded ozone data, there's been quite a significant decrease in stratospheric ozone due to CO2. There have been some increases in dust emissions in some of these models, increases in BVOC emissions as well. But we haven't really got enough data yet to actually calculate a full bar chart like I did for the other species. But just to know that that will have played some part that we don't yet know in the in the CO2 ERF that was diagnosed. Say in AerChemMIP, we also did some historical experiments, not just time slices, so looking how things evolved over the 20th century. Excuse me. So back to ozone. So Ragnall again did this looking at in ozone over the well, the last 100 years. She came up with a forcing that excludes the UK AerChemMIP model of about 0.41 watts per meter squared, which I think is a lot larger than we had in Stevenson et al. 2013. And that more or less agrees with adding up the sum of the ERFs that I showed in the a few slides ago. And it's also noticeable that she diagnosed quite a few of these models. In fact, probably the overall ozone radial forcing turned out to seem surprising if we know we're losing ozone in the stratosphere, but a lot of this ozone loss here, the bottom right picture, happens in a region where the kernel is negative, where ozone has a negative radial forcing. So depleting ozone up here actually will have given a positive forcing, and that's probably a lot of the reason why she found an overall net or close to zero stratospheric ozone forcing. So we heard from David on Friday about the OH changes, and he gets an OH increase over the last 150 years of about 9%, and we get a methane lifetime changes from those results I showed in the Thornhill paper about -6%. So that's again reasonable agreement with those studies. Also, Jill had another paper out, accepted, looking at the climate feedbacks. This is where climate change affects the chemistry of the atmosphere. So this was done comparing pre-industrial control run with a sort of a proxy for climate change being the abrupt 4 times CO2 change. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, CO2 also has chemical adjustments, so these are all a bit mixed in this result, and we haven't yet a clear way of separating these. So this is just to show the sort of results you can get. So climate change can affect the natural emissions. I won't go into these in too much detail, but there's very little agreement. So the stippling is, I didn't mention the stippling for the BVOCs. There's not much agreement on what happens in dust in the models. There's a reasonable agreement on what happens in DMS and sea salt and BVOCs. So we had quite a bit of talk on BVOCs in the discussion on Friday, so I just thought I'd put an extra slide in on that. So in these experiments, we looked at to work out what the climate effect of BVOCs was. We doubled the BVOC emissions, and this is the ERF plot from this, and you can see some big blue regions over, big blue colours over the main forested regions. And it turns out you get quite a strong negative forcing from organic aerosol in these models and a slightly weaker ozone forcing. But these models don't consider the methane lifetime effect, and increasing the VOCs gives you about a 24% increase in the methane lifetime in these models, which would actually be positive radial forcing, more or less compensating for the others. So I think, as we've seen before, what the total climate effect of BVOCs is close to zero with large negative and positive contributions. So what happens to ozone and methane in a warmer climate? So these are the right-hand side. These are the changes in ozone in these 4 times CO2 runs. What is most noticeable is this big change in ozone in the stratosphere, which is probably, if you like, an adjustment to the CO2 cooling in the stratosphere rather than a response to surface temperature. Overall, these models are all showing a net negative forcing from ozone due to quadrupling CO2. And we also have a decrease in the methane lifetime from a warmer climate as well, from quadrupling CO2. And you can put all these changes together to work out what effect this has on climate sensitivity, and that's what these bar chart shows, the negative and positive contributions that chemistry makes to climate sensitivity. And it turns out that if you exclude the methane, because we've got fixed methane, then overall these models are having a negative feedback. We've got increases in aerosols and decreases in ozone, basically in this 4 times CO2 climate. So you might possibly expect that the Earth system models to have a slightly more negative, or sorry, less strong climate sensitivity than the physical only models. Just very briefly on the future, actually I won't talk about the scenarios, so just because Steve Turnock mentioned these on Friday. So we can look at what happens to air quality policies on climate. So you can reduce the non-methane air quality, gives you a slight warming of climate, reduce methane and introduce methane and non-methane air quality controls, and that gives you a substantial cooling of climate. But there's been no attempt yet to break that down. What's the processes involved? What's happening to aerosols, ozone, or methane in these simulations? Presumably, a lot of these are contributing, or rather, these are contributing varying amounts in very different models to these range of forcing changes. So this is where I wanted to get to. So I've shown a sort of very quick whiz through of various results, but we haven't really explored how and why the responses to emissions vary between the models. How does it affect the aerosols, the ozone precursors, and methane lifetimes? There are a lot of diagnostics available, but we haven't really had any time to go into those yet. I've just put up some plots here on the right that Dave Stevenson did quite a few years ago now, showing you could look at correlations between various diagnostics to try and explain what's happening to ozone and methane lifetime. I put a question here: is there anything else we need to do to try and understand these experiments, rather than just looking at the results? Other questions: I've mentioned the chemical adjustments to CO2. There's also chemical adjustments to land use change. I know Nadine's interested in those. So there's a possibility of looking at how the emissions change, how dry deposition changes, stratospheric temperatures, and so on. What happens to climate? What impacts does climate have on composition in a polluted atmosphere? So a few people, I think, in GFDL have started looking at a particular run with fixed SSTs to look at the impact of climate change in one scenario. There's also possibility of, for instance, looking at the AMIP plus 4K run. So yeah, lots more to pull apart on that. So to move to the conclusions, so a lot of the motivation for AerChemMIP was trying to understand what was going on in Earth system models. So if we want to understand why they're making the projections they do, we need to understand what's happening to the aerosols and reactive gases in those. So I think it's a big point here that the Earth system interactions affect the climate impacts of greenhouse gases and aerosols. That really hasn't been brought out very much yet, so I think there's lots more to explore on that. And vice versa, turning the other way around, climate change, of course, affects the Earth system, and the Earth system therefore affects the composition of aerosols and reactive gases. So I mentioned a few papers that have come out already on these, but really I would say these were attempting a sort of a whole holistic, top level look to get policy questions out in time for IPCC. there's not been enough time to address the fundamental aerosol and chemistry science questions in these, and now I think that time is now right to start looking at those. Now we've got the first lot of papers out of the way. So I guess that my takeaway message that I want to get over is that there's an amazing amount of data available from CMIP6 and AerChemMIP diagnostics in particular. So I would encourage everyone to go out and analyze these, and there's lots more problems and questions and issues to delve into in this huge data set. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bill. There's a huge amount of work there that Jill, yourself and Ryan and others did, and there's lots of questions associated with it. In the interest of time, I'm just going to ask you two of the questions that appeared in the chat, and there are others as well that are in the Google Doc. The first question was from Nadine. The chemical adjustments are interesting. Have I understood correctly that the direct aerosol adjustment or contribution to the ERF is tiny?
So that was in the, I think I was showing the reactive gases. If you mean the plots, let's see if I can go back to this one. If you mean this plot, then the reactive gases seem to have very little effect. Notice I haven't looked at SO2 here, for instance, so this is just the ozone precursors or ozone depleters. Seem to have very little direct impact on aerosols, but they did have some large cloud adjustments. And obviously you, Fiona, looked at the fact that methane affects, although it doesn't affect the aerosol burden, it did seem to affect the aerosol nucleation of clouds. So yeah, so the indirect effect of aerosols seems to be much larger than the direct effect.
Yeah, this is very interesting. It's quite new. So the NOx and the methane, they have very little impact on direct aerosol forcing, basically, including the secondary aerosols like nitrate and sulfate.
Yeah, so I think you have to wait for Fiona's paper to explain who explains that.
Okay, I'm excited for the paper already.
Okay, I'm revising it at the moment following reviewer comments, but we've been able to explain that this positive cloud adjustment from methane, and as Bill said, we found very little contribution to the methane ERF from the direct aerosol effect.
So
and the global burden doesn't change.
It implies that there's, at the global scale, they're not oxidant limited, for example, forming nitrate and sulfate.
No, that's right. They're not oxidant limited. Now, we don't have nitrate, but we're not oxidant limited. So the global mean burden is relatively unchanged, but the size distribution has, and that's what's then driving the cloud adjustment. In the interest of time, I think we should move on. Bill, quite a lot of feedback on your talk, and there's lots of questions in the Q&A. If you want to go and address some of them, that would be great.
I will do so.
Thank you. And in fact, it's over to you, Bill, I think, to chair the lightning talks.
Oh, right. So
Apologies. And Paul, if you could share your screen, that would be great.
Okay, so the first talk is from Olaf.
Okay, so I'm going to talk just very briefly about the southern annular mode and CMIP6 simulations. If you can just move forward, perhaps to the first slide. So the southern annular mode is defined for my purpose as the pressure difference at the surface between 40 degrees and 65 degrees, so mid-latitudes minus polar latitudes. And you can see here that this pressure difference in CMIP, in the non-chemistry CMIP6 models, has in summer, that is in DJF, has increased by under 4 hectopascal that's the thick dark line. The thin lines are various single model averages. So to analyze this further, I formed a regression where I have two regressors, namely long-lived greenhouse gases and their radiative forcing as taken from AR5 and effective equivalent chlorine. That's basically the sum of all ozone-depleting substances weighed by their chlorine and bromine contributions. That's the light blue line, and you can see so it fits rather relatively well. And the light green line is the contribution only due to long-lived greenhouse gases. And you can infer from the shape of the curve and also from the relatively small numbers in that green line that almost all the increase in the sum index is driven by ODSs. And that is confirmed if you look at the HIST 1950HC experiment. The thick blue line here is the sum index as derived from those HIST 1950HC models, 6 of them that are listed on the left there. Also, the regression looks a little different, and I will get back to that in a moment. But if you compare this now to the HIST GHG experiment, this is an experiment done by non-chemistry models where only the greenhouse gases are changed and stratospheric ozone is in fact prescribed. You also get a significant strengthening of about more than 2 hectopascal. So that superficially contradicts the idea that the strengthening is all driven by greenhouse gases, all driven by ODSs. We've gone back to an idea that was developed 6 years ago in a paper in JRL in 2014, and now postulate that again, these 4 different plots that you see on the left can be brought into agreement by postulating that there's a substantial impact of greenhouse gas increases on stratospheric ozone that has to be represented correctly in order to get the strengthening of the southern annular mode correct. So that effect is of the order of 1 or 2 hectopascal, which is negative and cancelling the effect of stratospheric ozone. So you've got a positive strengthening due to greenhouse gas increases offset more or less completely by stratospheric ozone changes that go with that. So they in sum essentially increase ozone in high latitudes, so counteract the ozone depletion by ODSs. And if you don't have that effect correctly, you get the wrong trend in the sum. So that's basically producing a contrast now between chemistry and no chemistry models. And if you only use these latter 2 experiments here, which are from the DA-MIP experiment, you might arrive at the wrong conclusion as to what's driving some trends in the Earth's atmosphere. We go to the next plot, and Paul, can you move? Right. Okay. So the next thing we do is develop this regression model a bit further. So we have basically 3 terms in that regression model. One is the sort of pre-industrial seasonality of the summer. You get 2 peaks, one in spring and one in autumn. Those are known as the windy seasons in New Zealand, like now. And in between, we have sort of relatively quiet season in summer and winter. And if you now look at S1 is the contribution due to greenhouse gases, that contribution maximizes in winter and minimizes in summer. And the difference between the blue lines here and the red lines is the blue lines are the offline models, the ones that don't have interactive chemistry. The red lines are the chemistry models. And you can see in summer, for example, they disagree in sign. And generally speaking, the long-lived greenhouse gas influence is larger in the no chemistry models than in the chemistry models. And vice versa, S2 is the contribution to the ozone-depleting substances, maximizes in summer, that's well known. So the ozone depletion drives a strengthening of the sum in summer. Chemistry models say it's practically 0, whereas the no chemistry models have a negative contribution, actually a weakening effect of ozone changes in winter. And the sum of the 2 are pretty similar. So if you only look at strengthening, you might not be able to differentiate between those 2 models. But the regression analysis and also the sensitivity simulations that are available in CMIP6 tell you that there are significant differences between these 2 groups. So in summary, I think this just simply goes to show that it's important how ozone is treated in these models. And doing attribution studies on the sum with no chemistry models is fraught with some risks. And this is described a little more in a paper which I've submitted to JGR, which goes into some detail there. It'll appear in SOR sometime soon, I hope.
Thank you very much, Olaf. Guang?
Oh, hi, everyone. So in previous assessments, the model comparison activities is normally the stratospheric changes and the tropospheric changes are normally separately assessed. So in CAEMIP 6, we have several chemistry, the Earth system model have both stratosphere and tropospheric chemistry, and they're fully coupled. So this gives us an opportunity to look at the coupling, basically, between the stratosphere and the troposphere. So mainly changes in greenhouse gas and ODS drive the stratospheric changes in from pre-industrial to present day and to the future. So the impact from the stratosphere to the troposphere is mainly through kind of circulation change, namely rhodopsin circulation. So I'd like to look at what these, for example, changes in the age of air, how it evolved in the historical simulations with every forcing in, and also see if there's any correlation or the significant impact on the tropospheric changes like ozone. So also there are a few sensitivity simulations. We could attribute the changes to like ODS and to all changes, but it will be difficult to just separate the due to the long lived greenhouse gases because I don't think we have the fixed emission simulations. Just some idea. Could you go to the next page, please, Paul? Thanks. Next slide, please. Yeah. So there's few, not sure if you can see clearly, it's quite blurry. So just few diagnostics. The left column is the change, basic evolution of the age of air. From the black line is the historical, actually HIST and HIST SST, they're quite similar. So just for comparing with the 1950 halocarbon experiment, I just choose to plot HIST. The age of air basically is going down after 1950s. In the historical experiment, but so there are few models have the output. So first of all, the top is a UK ESM, and then the second row is MRI model. And I also plot GFDL, but they don't have the, they haven't submitted the age of air for the 1950 halocarbon simulation. So the impact from the ODS is quite obvious. So we have a reduced age of air, which means more a faster overturning from the stratosphere to the troposphere. So the middle columns inferred ST basically is almost similar to what's already in Paul's paper, but this is just HIST SST contrast with the HIST 1950 halocarbon simulations. So the impact is kind of visible. So for ozone burden, so it's all, yeah, the separation between these two simulations quite obvious, quite apparent as well. So basically, like that's just the starting idea, and yeah, I will also look at other diagnostics like calculations of the like tropopause height, how they change, and yeah, so that's just a start. Thank you.
Thank you, Guang. Now, Paul, you've got your own slides now.
Hopefully I can get them to work. Yeah, so I've been looking at ozone burden in the CMIP6 models, and particularly the tropospheric ozone burden, and that's led to an interest in the ozone budget, and particularly of interest at the moment are the factors controlling the pre-industrial tropospheric ozone burden and budget, you know, things like lightning, NOx, BVOC emissions, that kind of thing. If we look at the tropospheric ozone budget, we see large regions of positive tendency at the surface, which is the top left panel of my top left figure that I've cribbed from Alex's TOAR budget paper. You see large regions of negative tendency for tropospheric ozone in the free troposphere, and then in the upper troposphere we see ozone production again as a result of lightning NOx. And taken as a zonal mean, you can see that most of the ozone production happens in the northern hemisphere at the surface, but with this large upper tropospheric component due to lightning NOx. What's interesting in CMIP6, of course, as Guang was just saying, is that the troposphere is coupled to the stratosphere, and so we can also look at stratospheric influences on tropospheric ozone burden, which we diagnosed using the residual term in the budget. So including production and loss in the troposphere, dry deposition at the surface. If we assume that the budget balances, then we can pull out this residual term, which is the input from the stratosphere. And we can see that that starts off at about 400 teragrams in the UK AerChemMIP model, declines to approximately 0 around year 2000, and then starts to recover. So we expect an influence in 21st century of stratospheric ozone recovery on the tropospheric ozone burden and budget. But what I'm looking at the moment, and the project to which I invite you all to join, is just looking at the budget in the troposphere and worrying about questions to do with chemical production and loss. So I've broken production and loss down into the individual channels, which you can see on the bottom right, and plotted them as a function of time as we go through the CMIP historical integrations. And you can see that most of those budget terms increase as we go across the time period. What I've been looking at most recently is using the AerChemMIP runs to isolate the effect of the different chemically reactive gases. And so the idea is to combine the kind of gross budget terms that I showed in the previous slide, you know, HO2 plus NO, HO2 plus ozone, those kind of chemical reactions, and then use the AerChemMIP SST experiments to attribute what is the effect of the different emissions changes or forcings at the surface on that budget and on the burden. So you can see here I present a preliminary analysis of the tropospheric ozone burden in those different runs, also making use of Fiona's bespoke HIST-SST PI-VOC and HIST-SST PI-NOx experiments. And you can see there's important roles for methane in the tropospheric ozone burden. So if you look at the gold line, you can see that holding methane at pre-industrial levels and then integrating forward along a historical trajectory for other emissions and forcings gives quite a big, gives a smaller ozone burden, and we can attribute that change to the role of methane. But I'm breaking that down further. On the bottom panel, you can see how I've broken the production and loss terms down according to these different HIST-SST experiments, and also the net chemical production due to the net chemical production of ozone happening in the various experiments. And you can see that in general, across the whole period from 1850 to 2015, there's an increase in net chemical production of different amounts, admittedly. And so there must be something else going on in terms of if production is going up, but the burden is remaining approximately constant, that will need to be teased apart. And I look forward to sort of taking this to a conclusion of being able to say, well, what processes or at least having a guess at what processes are important to explain this behaviour of ozone and ozone budget. And that's all I've got to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. So I think it's Gerd next.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Paul. It seems there's a lot of interest in ozone these days. I'm proposing another set of work on tropospheric ozone. I mean, we all know that ozone, why ozone is so important in the atmosphere, both in the stratosphere and the troposphere. My focus is more on the troposphere. I'm also suggesting, that's a difficult word this morning for me, suggesting that there hasn't been enough progress over the years in understanding the complexities of the ozone chemistry. And in a way, I'm also thinking that we are focusing on the same diagnostics all the time. So maybe it would be good to think about other approaches as well. My focus, the focus that I am proposing, is on process understanding, I should point out. So really looking at in which way tropospheric ozone chemistry is coupled to individual processes in the Earth system. Can I have the next slide, please, Paul? So this is my proposition. I'm proposing to sample across the available data and experiments from AerChemMIP using a more general, more universal metric for sensitivity, which is the sensitivity index, which I've been working on for quite a while now. I'm proposing to split that work into several phases because there's a lot of work and it's will take quite some time to go through all that. So there will be a pilot to test the idea and to see whether there's enough data available from existing AerChemMIP simulations, which I think there is. And then should there be, well, during the phase one, I want to produce comparisons like the one I've been showing on the right-hand side, where we are calculating sensitivities in different areas of the troposphere, also different regions if we want to on the globe, and see how models differ in that aspect. And if we find during that period that we are missing some crucial experiments, I'm proposing a second phase where we could do some complementary experiments either with UK AerChemMIP or if anybody wants to join. So this is what I am proposing, and I'm happy to discuss more details with anybody who wants to join in that effort. Thanks, Paul. That's all. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Gerd. So Fiona has the last of the lightning talks.
I won't be last, Bill. There's a few after me.
I haven't got that list then.
It's on the most recent agenda. Shall I kickstart while you're looking at that? So I'm interested in doing some work on the attribution of ozone radiative forcing. Bill showed one of these slides earlier. This is from a paper by Ragnhild Ski that was published earlier this year, where she diagnosed the change in ozone over the historical period and applied an ozone radiative kernel to quantify the ozone radiative forcing. Using a diagnostic for the tropopause, she was also then able to apportion that radiative forcing to changes either occurring in the troposphere or to changes occurring in the stratosphere. However, there was no attribution done to the different drivers. So some of these changes in the troposphere will be influenced by ozone depleting substances, and some of these changes in the stratosphere will be influenced by ozone precursors. So the aim of my study is to use historical simulations to attribute the changes in ozone and its radiative forcing to different drivers, and I list some of the drivers there. Next slide, please, Paul. So the approach I'm going to use is listed there. I'm going to use the radiative kernel from Ragnhild Ski. I'm first of all going to check that the evolution of the ozone radiative forcing from the atmosphere only historical experiments is comparable with the coupled experiments that Ragnhild Ski used in her paper. And if that's the case, then it means I can legitimately use the HIST-SST sensitivity experiments to quantify the impact of different drivers on the ozone radiative forcing. And the simulations are listed there. And that's just a mock-up of what I might it might look like. So the red here is showing the time evolution from HIST-SST. But if halocarbons, for example, were fixed at 1950 levels, then we might expect something to follow the blue line and so on. And I will also quantify the potential response of ozone to historical climate change by potentially running a fixed climate experiment to see how much of this time evolution might be a climate response rather than a pure radiative forcing. So if you're interested in contributing, I'm more than happy to hear from you. Thank you.
Thank you, Fiona. And sorry, you're quite right. I found the PDF rather than the Google Doc now. So yes, so our next talk is by Sian.
Hi everyone, nice to meet you. My name's Sian Hyland. I'm a PhD student at the University of Exeter under the supervision of Nadine. And I'm looking into the attribution of ozone vegetation damage due to individual precursor emissions. So go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So the project objectives here, the rationale behind this is that it's global in scope and will enable a greater comprehension of anthropogenic precursor emissions which are needed to be reduced in order to mitigate against vegetation damage in the present day. So we'll be using global Earth system modelling to quantify the impacts of these emission drivers on land processes, GPP, NPP, and land carbon sink losses. So due to ozone being formed from the multiple precursors, it's not exactly known which one is the main anthropogenic driver. So this may differ across regions. So knowing this and finding this out is essential in developing effective mitigation strategies, which is crucial to protect global food security and the land carbon sink. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the approach for this project is we are going to apply the new data from AerChemMIP to Joule's land model. So we've taken the AerChemMIP historical SST experiments from UK AerChemMIP, and what we're going to do is run a historical simulation using the HIST-SST, using the surface ozone as input to the Joule's model. And then after that, we'll run a set of sensitivity experiments using the historical runs which hold certain emissions to pre-industrial levels, and then calculating the difference between these sets of runs in order to calculate the difference in GPP, NPP due to the individual precursor emissions. The Joule's simulations will be run with triffid and plant ozone damage, so in order to replicate a much more realistic effect of the Earth. So yeah, that's the research that I am currently undergoing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sian. Now, Sungbo.
Hi, yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you. I investigated impact of future air quality in East Asia under SSB scenario. Today's presentation is single model result, UK ASM1. I would like to expand the 3D result to CMIC6 ensemble data. First figure shows that spatial and scattering distribution of simulated PM concentration in present day control and compared to the surface observation data of open circles. You can see the performance of PM concentration was pretty good, and some China area tend to underestimate, but there is a clearly positive correlation. Please go to next slide, Paul. Thank you. East Asia PM concentration in present day is very high level, above the WHO and Korea guidelines. PM concentration are substantially reduced under strong and medium air pollution control as FP1, FP5, resulting in significant improvement. But interesting thing, SAP1 and SAP5 assume the same level implementation, but SAP5, which is the highest carbon emission scenario, has a much higher concentration compared to SAP1. But the weak and slow air pollution control in SSP3 tend to reach the high concentration level in East Asia. Please, next slide. We also calculated air quality index in East Asia. Air quality index is an indicator of increasing level of about health concern, divided into 6 categories based on the WHO guideline. You can see the most East Asia regions in present day exceed the unhealthy for sensitive groups, the cyan color. In the future climate, right panel, significant improvement in AQI under SSP1 and SSP5, but under SSP3 scenario, it was found that the area of very unhealthy area level would be doubled in China. Please, next slide. Anthropogenic aerosol and also can directly and indirectly reflect more sunlight. We know dimming effect. In the future, strong air pollution control can improve the air quality through the reduced PM concentration, but lead to unwanted warming due to the brightening effect in the near and mid-term future climate. Yeah, that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Sungbo. Now, Catherine.
Oh, hi there. I'm really sorry, but they're doing some construction next door, so I hope that's not too distracting for everyone. It's a bit distracting for me. So good morning, everyone. This is a really brief overview of our plans to investigate sulfur dioxide oxidation rates in UK AerChemMIP and the impact this has on effective radiator forcing. So the context to this is that SO2 is overpredicted in the UK AerChemMIP historical period, and this ultimately leads to too much cooling. And work we've done so far to improve the parameterization of SO2 dry deposition has improved the model's representation of atmospheric SO2. So next focus is the other main removal process, which is oxidation. So Jane has done some initial work comparing oxidant species and the sulfur budget in UK AerChemMIP and GC 3.1. So we can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So the two contour plots on the top left here are showing the difference in annual ozone and hydroxide between UK AerChemMIP and GC 3.1. And we can see that UK AerChemMIP is generally underpredicting both species compared with GC 3.1. And this was also the case for the other species that Jane looked at. But you can see there are some regional variations. So for example, in the Western USA and Central Southern America. And if we look at the budgets, which is the table on the right-hand side here, we can see that there are a number of differences there as well. So in particular, the oxidation lifetimes are shorter in UK AerChemMIP, implying that the oxidation is faster. So we've already made a start investigating the global and regional distribution of oxidants as well as the budgets. So our next steps will be to look at these in more detail and to understand how these differences are affecting climate forcing. So we'll look at the oxidants during the historical period using the CMIP6 model output, and we may use AMIP runs to look at the ERF. And I imagine we'll be doing some kind of sensitivity studies to see if we can further improve the SO2 concentrations in UK AerChemMIP.
And we may also be able to evaluate the model against observations. So from our previous work, looking at the dry deposition parameterizations, we've got observations from ground-based networks for the USA, Europe, and East Asia. And we've also now got a nice data set of total column SO2 from the OMI satellite, which has been developed by Richard Pope. So that could be useful here as well. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. And Scott, who I think is the last talker.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Yeah, I'm just going to be introducing some stuff about the common representative intermediates mechanism, which I have been developing for quite a while now, and is now officially ready for use in the UM from version 11.8. I did actually commit it a few versions before, but just please only use it from version 11.8 because there's a pretty major bug fix which I committed recently for that. So just to say, this is a simplified version of the MCM, but it's still quite a large extension on the existing strat-trop mechanism. So you can see it's got 233 species and 724 reactions, which includes a whole host of alkane, alkene, and aromatic chemistry, as well as alpha-beta-pinene for the monoterpenes. And its main advantage really is that its ozone production is fully traceable to the MCM. So in each stage of its development, it's been tested. And so even though it is more than twice as expensive, it is actually a bit less than twice as slow. So this is obviously still a big increase in computational cost, but it is still plausible to use it for multi-decadal and ensemble simulations. So I think this could be a really useful tool going forward. Can you go to the next slide, please? Okay. So we, in comparison with strat-trop, there's actually surprisingly little change to the ozone burden. Can you just tap again, please? Thank you. Actually, very slightly less, although this kind of hides the fact that there's quite a large change in the distribution of the ozone from changing the mechanism. So we have a huge increase in ozone production at the surface, particularly in polluted regions, and then generally a faster loss of ozone as well. What we see is this really quite large increase in both production and loss terms of ozone. We also see quite a strong sensitivity to the emissions of non-methyl VOCs, which change pretty significantly between cry-strat and strat-trop, which is pretty informative, and it might be very helpful for developing strat-trop going forward. Can you go to the last slide, please? So I've just highlighted a few key differences between the mechanisms. In terms of what we could be doing with AerChemMIP, I think there's some very interesting changes to the sensitivity of ozone. And possibly following on to what Gerd was talking about earlier, there may be some useful sensitivity analysis to understand how that changes between pre-industrial and present day. What that means for our uncertainties and our future model projections, given the uncertainty that we have in the chemical mechanism itself. We also expect there to be a lot of changes to aerosols, although we haven't fully investigated this. And yesterday, James talked about CRI version 2.2, which we're also currently working with here. And this has a lot more of the up-to-date knowledge of isoprene chemistry, which, yeah, we'll see his talk from yesterday. So the paper has been written. It should have been in GMDD by now, but unfortunately it got held up due to various reasons. So I'm in the process of resubmitting it to James. But yeah, should watch this space for more information.